Bueno, el doctor Calvin Hayes de la Universidad de Brock ha escrito dos libros, uno se llama Fallibilism, Democracy in the Market y otro se llama, que es el que he leído yo, Popper, Hayek and the Open Society. Ahora el título de su conferencia es Hayek, Zen and the Idea of Social Justice.
Okay, I'm tempted to start like I think with Monty Python now for something completely different. Instead of a technical economic analysis, we're going to fly to the clouds of political philosophy. We're going to do it with two Nobel Prize winning economists. And what I'm going to begin with, before I get into my PowerPoint presentation, which doesn't actually indicate the direction in which this paper is going, what I'm going to do is read an introduction I prepared for an earlier practice session with this with friends of mine back in Canada to explain where this paper, what started this paper, and where it is going. Okay, the recent appearance of Amartya Sen's The Idea of Justice is both encouraging and disturbing. I begin my paper by answering the obvious question, why both? The encouraging parts I find are in his preface and introduction, where he clearly rejects what he labels transcendentalist theories of justice, i.e. utopian perfectionist versions. He also has a very good chapter 2 on John Rawls, one of the names you see up there, a man he much admires and dedicates his book to. In many ways, his book is an attempt to overcome many of what he sees as the drawbacks of Rawls' magnus opus, a theory of justice. And the differences between them involve more than just the semantic differences in their titles. The two major organizing themes in this paper, which doesn't become obvious in my rather disorganized slides, but I'm following actually Sen's example. His book, he looks very well organized, but he does go all over the place, but in an interesting fashion. Two major organizing themes are, first of all, the differences between Rawls and Sen on justice, and the question most relevant to this conference, does Sen articulate a set of consistent ideas about justice that would effectively refute Hayek's claim that the term social justice is a meaningless term? And Sen does use that term over and over and over again, and if I ever get around to turning this into my third book, I'll get my editor to count how many times. Sen uses that term repeatedly as if there was never any problem ever raised by anyone of importance challenging its coherence. My answer is that Sen does not refute Hayek, and it does not matter that it's very clear that this was not his intention to do so. Let's see, two of the best challenges to Hayek's The Mirror of Social Justice, and two books I brought with me, Hayek's, The Mirage of Social Justice, were published in the same decade. In fact, four of the 5 names you see up there, Rawls, Nozick, Hayek, and Guwerth, were philosophers who wrote, well, one's an economist, but Hayek was writing as a political philosopher in the 1970s. It's a paper represented at Brock University in History of Economic Society. Sen discusses, I say occasionally refers to Hayek, actually twice, but both times in footnotes, engages in no systematic discussion of his views, despite his emphasizing, as Hayek does, injustice as a key to defining justice and recognizing individual as well as institutional justice, unlike Rawls, who is almost totally focused on institutional and not individual justice. Okay, that's the introduction that tells you where this paper is going, and this is the title page of the paper I presented at Brock in the HES 2012 Hess Conference at Brock University. Okay, now although, or maybe because my background is history and philosophy, not economics, and those emphasize though European history and philosophy, I submitted an abstract on political philosophy and economics in the 1970s, and my second book was called Popper, Hayek, and the Open Society, which is what got me the invitation to the Argentine conference 4 years ago. That paper was easier to do than this one, because all I did was plagiarize a chapter from that book before it had come out. And also, I mostly teach business ethics at Brock University, which actually is relevant to some of what I've done here. Okay, the structure of this paper. Now, there is a slight change in my plans and what I was originally hoping to do. I am going to start with the flute problem, which Sen brings into his introduction. It's an interesting problem. I was also hoping to show the interesting YouTube, the fight of the century, which is a hilarious 10-minute account of the Hayek-Keynes debates. And they actually show them in the boxing ring. If you haven't seen it, there's the, well, actually, you don't even need that title. All you have to do is go to YouTube and type in the fight of the century. And I actually will quote a couple of things from that extremely interesting YouTube presentation, which is, I thought, extremely fair to both of them. And in the end, neither of them actually wins, or appears to be the winner. And it does reflect, I think, extremely well their arguments. And actually, a couple of them from that YouTube will appear in later PowerPoints. And I'm also going to talk about I call it possibly Good Samaritan updated, because Sen actually discusses this example and discusses a person who thinks there is no duty to be a Good Samaritan, and we'll explain that when I get there. Okay, let's start with the flute problem, and this one comes from Sen himself. And if this were a regular classroom, I would actually have you tell me which one of these three. In fact, I'd make you put them in order, because later it ties in with Sen's borrowing of the arrow theorem, which you're probably aware of. But I just want to introduce it this way. ABC, Anne, Barbara, and Calvin. There's a flute, one flute, and only one of these children can have it. Anne actually happens to be the name of my sister-in-law. Barbara's the name of my wife. Calvin, of course, that's my name. Okay, Anne is the only person that can play a flute. Barbara is the one who made the flute. Actually, it's Bob in Sen's example, and it's Carol, I think, but heck, is a very poor boy who owns no toys. Okay, and so Sen gets into reasons why people say, well, yes, Anne should have it, no, Barb should have it, no, Calvin should have it. And of course, a lot of us, particularly those who are strong on property rights, will say, well, look, Barbara's the one that made it, engaged her hockey and labor into it. But this is how Sen tries to motivate an appreciation for the difficulties he sees, and many others, in defining what justice actually demands. And as you can see, I also have the fight of the century link here as well. Okay, the possibly Good Samaritan. What I'm going to do here, it's not only because this Good Samaritan is possibly good, but I'm going to give a 21st century updated version, just as I did at the Hess conference, and they put me on at 8 o'clock Sunday morning. But they did put me in the Hayek group. Bruce Caldwell was there, Karen Bond was the chair, the woman that wrote that wonderful book on Austrian economics in America. So it was interesting being on that panel. Okay, here's how I updated the Good Samaritan story. Since these names, there's no names in the original story told by Jesus of Nazareth, for those of you who don't know or possibly forgot that. And I'll just choose the name Calvin for this person who's going from one city to another. He gets caught by a gang of crooks and beaten pretty much to a pulp. It actually says half dead in the Bible. And along came two religious leaders who look at him and look the other way and cross by. And then along comes a Samaritan, a member of a rather despised group apparently in those days. And in my version, He binds up Calvin, puts him in his SUV, drives him to the nearest hospital, gets out his credit card and pays for all his medical expenses. Okay, now, in this story, it introduces quite a number of the important ideas for understanding both the similarities and differences between Sen and Hayek. They are often seen as different. I'm not sure I want to say they're very different, but they certainly are different. So now I'm going the wrong way. Okay, reflecting on this story, Calvin, the victim in the updated Good Samaritan story, his negative rights were violated. His rights not to be harmed, bodily assaulted by other people. Now, two religious leaders, if you think they did something wrong or failed to do something good, then what they were guilty of is ignoring their positive duty. So we're going to get into explaining these things because they're extremely important to debates between different conceptions of justice, and they're particularly important in the chapter by Hayek, The Mirage of Social Justice, in volume 2 of his Law, Liberty, and Legislation, where he attacks the whole idea of social justice and relates it to the difference between positive and negative rights, or, as I prefer to put it, negative rights and positive duties. Okay, the Good Samaritan, some people would say, performed imperfect duties, what Immanuel Kant would say are duties that don't have rights attached to them, and I'll get into them later as well. And we get to sense discussion, see there's some people that don't even think there are any duties involved. We shouldn't have expected the two religious leaders to do anything, or anyone else. The Good Samaritan could have gone by without becoming a bad Samaritan. But he did act according to the principles of negative utilitarianism. And those of you who are familiar with Karl Popper as well as Hayek, and if you're not, you can read my book on Hayek and Popper and learn a lot. I'm going to explain negative utilitarianism, because it's one of only two versions of utilitarianism as an ethical theory that I think is defensible, because it emphasizes the negative side of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism has had an interesting history since the time of Jeremy Bentham. Originally it was the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and happiness here means you want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Of course, today it becomes maximizing benefits, minimizing costs. Or there are other versions of utilitarianism today that means maximizing your preferences and minimizing what you don't want to have happen to you. And it consists of three things, and this is my interpretation, or what I tell my students when I'm explaining negative utilitarianism. And this slide also illustrates the technical problems I ran into doing these PowerPoints in 4 different computers in 2 different countries. I started in Canada on my home and university computer, and then was finished on the hotel and this university's computers. The negative side of utility emphasizes minimizing pain and suffering rather than maximizing happiness or utility for other people. There's nothing necessarily wrong with doing it for yourself, but you have no duty to do it to other people. Your duties are to avoid inflicting harm, the idea of negative rights, help prevent harm if it is possible, and help relieve pain and suffering if possible. And the if possible, of course, is important, and this is one of the points Popper, or Hayek emphasizes. Popper does too, but not as much as Hayek does in his Mirage of Social Justice, is you can only have duties, particularly positive duties towards someone, if you're capable of carrying them out. And it's also rather crucial, as he points out, and a lot of people tend to ignore this, if you are going to bring in positive duties without specifying who has these duties, your theory is defective. And as we'll see, Hayek doesn't 100% rule them out, but modern social justice, particularly even more recent theories and sense theories, definitely include them. And he does spend quite a bit of time looking at different aspects of what justice is. Okay, there's Mr. John Rawls, the original hero of Sen. Sen was a student of his, he admired him, he taught with him, and I also found out, interestingly, he taught with Robert Nozick, one of the 5 names at the beginning. Nozick's very opposite of most social justice theories. He's libertarian, in fact, I think the most sophisticated of libertarians, but I really only want to talk about Rawls because it's his theory that Sen wants to go beyond and still incorporate a lot of what he had. And I found it interesting, I didn't realize this, reading this up on Sen, it actually taught not only with philosophy departments with people like Rawls, but with Nozick too. And that must have been a very interesting class. Okay, and also, actually these are things I use in my business ethics class, so I decided I may as well borrow them. And I mentioned to the students, I think Rawls looks like the stereotypical Hollywood professor, sort of wimpy nerd with glasses and that sort of thing. And they probably think, yeah, so do you, Professor Hayes, but at least I don't. Well, anyway, his idea of justice is fairness, and he turned it into a very elaborate theory. And his book was written in 1971. Nozick's book was a counter to it, was written in 1974, called Anarchy, State, and Nature. And in between, Hayek wrote the first of his 3 volumes, Law, Liberty, and Legislation, 1973, and then 76 and 79. He finished them in 1976, was his, the mirage of social justice. Now, Rawls' theory is based on the social contract idea, and it's anti-utilitarian with a rather interesting argument, I think. And actually, this is maybe the best argument in Rawls. And the basic premise is the difference between individual and collective utility, or actually aggregate utility, as in modern use of the term. But I prefer the term actually collective utility to aggregate utility. Okay, and because I teach at a university, this helps get points across to my students, I hope. Person 1, this is individual utility, decides for herself to pass up on a benefit or to impose a cost on herself to do tremendously well while at Brock University. Today actually happens to be a Canadian holiday. And normally I'd be in Canada preparing for Wednesday when my students are writing tests too. So my students today should be studying hard for their Wednesday class. Fortunately, I have people who can take care of that, so I can take a break in the middle of teaching. But I try to get this point across. There's a difference between you imposing costs on yourself. I will give up going to this party, or watching this TV program, or engaging in some other more fun activity than reading these boring textbooks. If you do that for the long run benefit or utility of yourself. Person 2, however, decides on behalf of a group or an entire nation or society to impose costs on or to deprive others of benefits in order to maximize utility for the whole group, society, or nation. Okay, I assume I shouldn't have to tell this group who Larry Summers is. He has a very interesting resume. One of the interesting cases I use in my business ethics class is 20 years ago when he proposed, when he was at the World Bank, I believe, that rich countries should pay poor countries to take our pollution away, and he justified it on a cost-benefit or utilitarian basis. And there's a rather interesting argument he presents. It appeared in The Economist. He got a lot of flack for this, although it seemed to be less flack than he got when he was at Harvard. And what he said about women in that, but at any rate, the point of this, though, is to illustrate that's collective utility. You are imposing costs on someone else to make the utility of the, or allegedly make the utility of the group as a whole superior rather than person one. And he says, under the terms in which you make a social contract, we would not agree to that. Okay, I'm going to mention the three key ideas in Rawls, and we'll go into some detail. The original position is not that of Adam and Eve, Kaching, or Neanderthal man, or Homo erectus, or it's our situation. We begin negotiating the social contract, and we make it behind what he called the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance, the difference principle, of things that are hard to getting across to my students, even though it seems to me, if you think about it, not that difficult. And I'm going to compare this to Sen's discussion of the impartial spectator. Sen has a lot of good things to say about Adam Smith. He quotes him frequently, and he likes his idea of the impartial spectator. Well, the veil of ignorance is Rawls' sort of substitute. We are ignorant of our race, ethnicity, class, nationality, talents, intelligence, and gender. And he doesn't use IQ, but I use it short form for intelligence. Now, what's the point of being ignorant of what we cannot possibly be ignorant of? Is to prevent self-interested bias when we choose out of pure self-interest in an impartial manner the principles of justice and fairness. So you do not know whether you're going to be born rich or poor, what racial group, whether you're going to be a man or a woman, or what talents you have, including possibly musical talent, sports talent, etc. Okay, under this we would opt for two principles: equal liberty, which doesn't distinguish his position from the tradition going back to the great liberal tradition, John Locke, Kant, Mill, etc. The difference principle is his most controversial, I think, of all principles. And interestingly, when the book first came out, Hayek commented on the margin of justice, social justice, and he actually has favorable things to say about Rawls, but he changed his mind later. All right, the difference principle, I emphasize difference because it's meant to deal with what justifies economic inequalities. They must work for the benefit of the least well off. Why? Because in the veil of ignorance, we don't know what our IQ or our talents are or anything else about ourselves, so we might be born in the lower class. We could even be born as a slave, so that means we wouldn't want to be born as slaves, so we're going to reject slavery as a principle. He also thinks, by the way, and this is thing where he doesn't have very many people who follow him, that not only is it unfair that some people are born more intelligent, better off, with more, say, natural talent for sports or music or whatever. This is not only unfair, it's unjust. So a lot of people say, well, it might be unfair. This would be like Hayek's position. Yeah, this could be unfair, but it's not unjust if it's not due to what another human being does to you. Okay, now we'll get to Hayek's mirage of social justice, the negative part. Now, most of you, I assume, should know what the economic calculation argument is, and it was worked out especially by, of course, von Mises first and then Hayek, and I think what Hayek added to it, the knowledge argument, is absolutely wonderful, devastating argument. He did it in 1937. He sometimes seemed to wish he was refuting Keynes at that time instead, but I think it's better to spend his time on this. Okay, this is very important, class. You'll be tested on it later, because we are having dinner later. Society is not a person, although it is real. Maggie Thatcher once said, society is not real, only individuals and families are real. Samuel Britton correctly refuted her and rebuked her for saying that. And so Hayek does not think society is unreal. It is real, but it is not a person, and only persons can have moral duties. society is not a person, so it therefore cannot have moral duties. A very airtight, logical argument. And he then goes to what some people might think is an extreme position: social justice is a meaningless term. And I noticed there was a talk on this afternoon along with the 3 volumes, and I'm sorry I missed them, but if those people are here, well, you can ask me some difficult questions afterwards. Okay, I assume you know who these 3 people are. Karl Marx on the far left, of course, and my students can often guess, even though they're not doing history, Locke, Adam Smith, etc. We needed a break like that, didn't we? Okay. Hayek also has a lot of positive theses. And I've got 3, starting with free competition, which actually I break down under 3 different categories, which were numbered 1, 2, 3 in the original, but now they turned into question marks. First, free markets, but not laissez-faire. Hayek makes it clear over and over and over again, he does not like the idea of laissez-faire. Complete free trade on a global basis. And interestingly, you won't find in the index of Sen's book, there's no references to free trade, despite the fact he's interested in international, global justice and that sort of thing. I think one of the worst injustices we inflict on the poor countries is barriers we put up to them importing to us. I think, for example, what the EU does to protect their farmers from competition of farmers from outside Europe. And finally, the rule of law is number 3. All right, here's where Hayek differs from pure libertarians like Nozick and Rand and a whole bunch of other libertarians. He accepts taxation for welfare purposes and government regulation of safety and health, but not of wages and prices. And this is very, very important. If we're going to help the poor and needy, don't do it by controlling prices or wages in the marketplace. Do it outside the marketplace. He does recognize positive duties as well as negative duties. And I always like pointing this out. He supported the decriminalization of homosexuality in 1960, Constitution of Liberty, long, long before progressive left-wingers took up this cause. And now it's supposed to be you're conservative if you don't believe in that. And he was, well, that's the book he wrote, that wonderful appendix, Why I Am Not a Conservative. It's what first got me excited about Hayek, reading that. Governments can legitimately regulate what people produce, but not who can produce whatever is legal. So whether we necessarily want to decriminalize hard drugs and this kind of thing, and a lot of other things, well, he'd be open on that, unlike being some libertarians. But okay, now I have to thank Lawrence White. I found it in his wonderful book, The Clash of Economic Ideas, and this is where I got the idea to have the fight of the century. So this was a paper, I should have a footnote referring it. And I love this conversation. And it's actually right out of the fight of the century. Keynes, even you must admit that the lesson we've learned is that more oversight's needed or will get burned. I guess I should, yeah, needed, should be needed. Oversight, this is Hayek. The government's long been in bed with those Wall Street executives and the firms they've led. And when I read that, I couldn't help thinking, gee, doesn't that sound like the Occupy Wall Street people? And the only problem is that they seem to be, as far as I can tell, anarchists on the left, rather than the alleged other side. Now, below that line, this is not part of the fight of the century. And I'm not sure where Keynes said this, to tell you the truth. It's a mistake to say that businessmen are more immoral than politicians, which, because it's a double negative, you have to think of it. He's not saying politicians are worse than businessmen. He's saying they're not better than businessmen. Interesting comment coming from a person with confidence that they could correct the failures of the market or the failure of Say's law, etc. Okay, now at last, and this is the title of my paper, Hayek's and the idea of social justice. And what I've done is I've inserted the term social into his title of his book. It's an attempt to go beyond Rawls and all transcendental institutional views of justice in favor of comparative individual plus institutional view, which therefore puts it closer to the theories of justice I prefer, in addition to, like, I didn't get interested in Austrian economics. At first I was interested in Austrian philosophy, particularly my dislike of logical positivism. That's why I liked Karl Popper. I found he was a critic of it. And Popper's theory of justice, like that of Hayek's, emphasizes a comparative view. The open society, democracy, the market, they're not perfect, they're better than every alternative. And also, it's not just in institutions, at least some things like the laws of a society can be unjust as they're made by people, but individual injustice is something that tends to get lost sight of too much when you get obsessed with social justice. Now, I'm going to skip over the rest because he does cover a lot of people, and I think one of the great things about this book is you may know he was born in India almost 80 years ago. So he was 9 or 10 years old, and a terrible famine during World War II took place, and lots of people died. In his opinion, probably correctly, as far as I can tell, unnecessarily. There's a lot of other people in the same part of India did not die, and ever since then, I think this may be his greatest contribution, is his study of famine. I'll skip over the rest of the names in there. Okay, I was going to go through the structure of his book, but he has 4 parts of it, so it looks tremendously organized, and under each of these he has 4 or 5 chapters. What I had to do, I mean, there's 18 chapters, so I don't have enough time to touch on very much in detail, but he does see that the weakest part, I think, is not the 4th part per se, but the theme of the 4th part, the link between public reasoning and democracy, because he thinks we can find out what justice is by looking at democratic public deliberation about what justice is. So he doesn't actually come up with his own theory of justice like Rawls and Nozick and these other people did. His preface and introduction is very interesting. He has an interesting criticism of Rawls, but a lot of sycophantic praise for him, as well as Obama later. He has a much more acute and devastating critique of Rawls can be found in a book I just discovered last week. Tom Sowell's come up with a new edition of Intellectuals and Society that looks about twice as big as it. And he has an excellent chapter which he uses arguments very similar to those of Hayek in The Mirage of Social Justice, and he does acknowledge a lot of his stuff does come from Hayek, and he makes use of a lot of the arguments Hayek uses about the impossibility of carrying out the rights that people who believe in social justice, or the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Its positive rights are too vague and no clue is given on how you're supposed to carry them out. Sen does have, however, an excellent critique of Rawls' institutional and transcendental theory. It's transcendental in the sense that you don't compare, your society with the rest of the world, which one is more just or unjust. You compare it with the perfect, what would a perfectly just society look like, and what would its institutions be like. And these are exactly the points that critics like Hayek and Sowell make about so-called social justice. A utopian idea, and because it focuses on the institutional rather than the individual, it misses the real source of most injustice. Okay, moving backwards now. All right, here's one of the interesting things I learned, not knowing. I had once studied a course in Indian philosophy, but so long ago. Here's 2 terms that he likes to contrast. And it comes, he says, from ancient Indian jurisprudence. He draws a lot on Indian thought and philosophy. Niti denotes organizational propriety, behavioral correctness, Nyaya, comprehensive concept of realized justice, the outcome of what emerges from our institutional rules. That, of course, would be something like social justice. The Niti would capture individual behavior, and the organizational propriety is still the individual behavior of people within certain organizations like government or businesses, universities, other institutions. He has an interesting chapter on liberty and equality. One of the tricky things with following him is he wants to avoid, as people like Hayek and Popper generally, and I've heard this mentioned today, essentialist definition. So why should there just be one definition of liberty or one of equality? The key difference between left and right is supposed to be over liberty and equality, but it's really the key difference between socialism and free market capitalism. And I've underlined that because capitalism isn't always, in fact, many parts of the world, it isn't free market capitalism. It's close to state or oligarchical capitalism. The underlying terms are not a pleonasm. Actually, I'm going to skip over the next part, which is interesting, because he gets in chapter 17, when he gets into questions of human rights, he raises quite correctly the point that people who talk about rights very seldom argue why we should believe in human rights. The U.S. Declaration starts by saying they're all self-evident. The French Revolution put together liberty, equality, fraternity, and of course we have to add sorority today, and they had lots of declarations of human rights. By the way, who abolished the slave trade and slavery first? Not the United States or France. Britain, while they were fighting Napoleon during the French Revolution. Okay, in defense of the Canadian liberal. I'm introducing this before I introduced, and I tried to move these PowerPoints with damn computers. Okay, this is repeating what I said earlier. The only two defensible versions of utilitarianism is a moral philosophy of negative utility and Pareto improvement. And this is my solution to the Sen theorem of both Pareti and liberal, which I'll come to in a few minutes. Now, here's the problem of social choice is basic to understanding the Sen theorem, and if you know the arrow theorem, it's a very wonderful problem that Arrow pointed out a long time ago, and then Sen turned it into a version to create problems for a Pareto liberal, and I have a solution, well, or an evasion, but it's a good evasive solution. If you're not familiar with this, suppose you give a choice between Anne, Barbara, and Calvin, or it could be three political parties, as we have in Canada, unlike the United States. You could get a person preferring the Conservatives to the Liberals to the NDP, and then someone else who prefers B to C to A, and someone else. And if 1/3 of the people prefer the first choice, 1/3 the second, and 1/3 the third, then 2/3 of people prefer A to B, 2/3 prefer B to C, and 2/3 prefer C to A, which violates transitivity. Individual transitivity doesn't translate into social transitivity, which creates a serious problem for democracy. Okay, now there's only one of these points that Sen mentions, so I tried to delete the other 5 points, and I don't have time to get into the others, but I like the fact that Sen quoted one of my favorite sayings from Karl Marx. What is to be avoided above all is reestablishing society as an abstraction above the individual, and yes, that came from Karl Marx. The same Karl Marx that a few years later helped produce the Communist Manifesto, which communism, of course, does eventually put society above the individual. Now, Sen hastens to point out, he likes this thing, just as I do, points out this does not support methodological individualism, and he says it as if there's something obviously wrong with methodological individualism, which I don't like. Somebody mentioned in one of the last 2 or 3 lectures I heard about. All right, here's his main difference with other theories of liberty, the capabilities approach. And I remember teaching this some 10 years ago, and it's a tricky thing to teach, but he has 3 interesting cases that, due to time constraints, how much time do we have, by the way? Okay, well, yeah, I can cut this down to about 10 minutes. But anyway, the 3 cases help show to him there's no point having freedom unless you have the capability to carry it out, which up to a point is true, but his 3 cases are disabled people. The first person has nobody to help her, so she not only physically can't move, she can't leave her house because no one is around to help her. The other 2 people do have people that can help them, but the one person is dependent both on a social agency and volunteers coming in. So yes, she can get out of the house. She can get out of the house, even though physically she can't get around, but she's dependent on other people. The third one owns servants who have to obey her. He gets into questions as to, whether the can in the same, in these cases is the same. My problem with this is, I still think it's important that I have the opportunity to compete for a Nobel Prize in physics. There's no way I'll ever get it. Or to be the greatest singer since Caruso. Just ask my wife how close I am to that. Or to be, I once wanted to be the greatest hockey player. Well, neither of those will happen, but not good enough. I still think it's important we do have the freedom, because not every society allows that. Okay, now, here's how I avoid, I won't get into Mill's argument unless somebody has a question about it. I think the way to get around the Pareto problem is to use Pareto improvement rather than Pareto optimality, but because my PowerPoints are out of, that's why my PowerPoints are disorganized as Sen's book, and why I gave you the reading at the beginning to tell you where I'm going. He talks a lot about the impartial spectator of Adam Smith, which I think is a great idea for encouraging us to think in terms of getting away from bias and self-interest. Is it better than the veil of ignorance? Yes, it is, especially when it's combined with his chess metaphor cited by Hayek in The Fight of the Century. And when I read that argument from Adam Smith, and I think Hayek must have quoted it somewhere, and that's why it got into the fight, because it isn't something he made up. But the impartial spectator eliminates the absurdity of imagining our ignorance about our own gender, class, ethnicity, and at least a few of our talents. I couldn't tell you what my IQ is. I could just say it must be above average, or I wouldn't be teaching at a university, right? But I don't particularly care what it is. But I know I'm not stupid, but I also know there's a lot of things I'm not smart at. All right, here is Adam Smith's, I think, devastating argument against all the socialist plans, and creates a problem for almost any theory of social justice, including what I think Rawls wants, and what I suspect is the direction Sen is headed in. The man of system is so convinced of his own ideal plan of government, he seems to imagine he can arrange the different pieces of a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces on a chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses on it. So I was told when I was learning chess that the queen is the most powerful piece on the board, but she isn't, of course. She can't even make her first move until a pawn moves out of the way for her, and it's somebody else that moves the pawn and somebody else that moves the queen. In the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, different from what the legislator might choose to impress a pawn. And this, of course, couldn't have been written against socialist, utopian, communist schemes of the 19th century, but of schemes in his own day. Okay, rights and imperfect duties. Chapter 17, the problem of justifying rights. And Sen is very good at this, explaining, there really is a problem. Activists aren't interested in justifying these, just in changing the world. And this is why I'm curious about why Alan Gore fourth or fifth name on my list, who in 1978 wrote the best argument I've ever seen in favor of human rights, both positive and negative, but the word is missing from this book. And the index has no reference to rights. He does talk about them in chapter 17, including the negative-positive distinction, and he's also very enthused about the 1948 UN Declaration, particularly since it has all that stuff about positive rights, but I think, Sowell and Hayek have really good criticisms of some of those rights. There are negative rights there. Okay, I'm going to skip over this stuff here, just to get into what the difference between positive and negative rights are. It's crucial to understanding Hayek's mirage of social justice. The latter, negative rights, is the distinction in the ordinary citizen's behavior in regard to these duties. As I like to tell my students, negative duties can be honored by a couch potato doing nothing. So when you're sitting there doing nothing, you are not harming anybody in the rest of the world. You're not helping anybody. But positive duties require some person or persons to do something to benefit others. And the key question is, actually my business ethics textbook is in this, and he points out it's often unclear who these positive duties fall on. And unfortunately, there seems to be a sort of automatic jump, well, it must be the government. But if you think about children, don't we assume parents have the first group? The family should have the first responsibility, positive duties toward the children, and there's charities and other institutions. The state should actually be the sort of last resort, you would almost hope. Imperfect duties don't have any rights. Even most interior duties, nice word to throw around, it's the same as charity. It's the way I saw the problem of animal rights. Animals don't have rights, but we have duties not to be cruel to them. And of course, I was at the talk today about marriage. Of course, is marriage a contract? Well, I'm distinguishing contracts and marriage and having children, but if you do any of these three things, you create rights for other people and duties for yourself. Okay. The Sen theorem builds on the arrow theorem by trying to create a problem with examples like lewd and prude. Lewd likes reading. He used the example that Lady Chatterley's Lover, who was way the hell back to the 20s, but I remember when we were in high school, that was a bad book to read. And lewd wants to read it, prude doesn't want to read it, and he doesn't want anybody else to read it, and then he sets it up so that it leads to a contradiction. I can't get into the details due to time, but which conflicts with the Pareto optimality, and I'm using actually Pareto's term in either Italian, I think that's Italian, but anyway, it's usually Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality. But Pareto improvement is much better because that requires only somebody's better off or people involved in exchange are better off, which should always happen in a voluntary business exchange, but of course it doesn't for various reasons. That gets around that problem as far as I'm concerned. You don't need Pareto efficiency. It's like somebody said about equilibrium in one of the recent lectures. It doesn't exist, neither does Pareto optimality. You never get there, but you can have millions and billions of Pareto improvements. Somebody's better off, both sides are better off, nobody's worse off. And that, I think, takes care of that problem. Okay, I'll skip over the first part, which is interesting, but I don't want to get into too much detail. Just point out the interesting fact. Sen's the first person, I think, to point out the danger of gendercide in his own home country. Fewer girls are being born there and in China. But I'd rather talk about what I think is his best contribution, famine prevention, which he discusses in chapter 16. He's well known for claiming famines do not take place in a democracy, because a democracy, even if they don't give a damn about the people, would be too embarrassed if they don't do something about it. And my understanding of his argument does fit in with Hayek's view. Do not interfere with the market mechanism, let it grow the food these people need, and then subsidize the people who cannot afford it. Therefore, you're providing help outside the office. That's too bad. I want to take 10 minutes. I'm down to the final three, I think. Liberty and freedom, are they the same? It's a question he raises, and I'm going to answer it for him. And I'm just going to say no, and I'm going to use this theories of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, and I'm going to take this, it's what the way I like to define freedom, the right to do anything you want to do. Well, that easily leads to a contradiction if universalized or even just extended to more than one person, because I might want your money or your body, or to turn you into my slave, and you might want to do that to me, but I don't want it, you don't want that, so we can't have the right to do anything we want. Only one person could possibly have this right. Liberty puts limits on your freedom. John Stuart Mill's famous harm theorem: you have the right to do anything you want unless it causes harm to other persons. Being a utilitarian, Mill should include animals, as Bentham did, because they can suffer pain. But I've always preferred Adam Smith's alternative, the right to do anything you want unless it violates justice. This is what his system of natural liberty is. You can engage in any free exchange with other people or do what you want, but it shouldn't violate the laws of justice. And he's using justice in the old-fashioned sense of an undeserved harm inflicted on someone, which is a negative definition of liberty, of justice. And that's one of the things Sen emphasizes in this book. I think it brings him closer to Hayek, that we should really start by looking at what injustice is, because the world is filled, he's right about this, injustice, primarily due to, in my opinion, the action, Hayek's and others, the injustice of numerous individuals. Okay, and I shocked at my test thing by saying the winner of those four people, somebody not mentioned. I love Karl Popper's theory of justice, his theory of negative utility and the open society, but I also like Hayek's contribution. And if you want an interesting book that discusses both of them, see mine. Okay, that's, yes.